In 1943, Japanese Zero pilots ruled Pacific skies with absolute confidence. Then the F6F Hellcat arrived, and everything changed. Within months, Japan's elite aviators weren't just losing, they were terrified. Intercepted reports revealed shocking admissions of inferiority. Training bulletins warned pilots to avoid the Hellcat at all costs. But how did Japan's perception shift from dismissal to dread? The truth buried in their own documents tells a darker story than anyone expected. When the Hellcat first appeared over Pacific battlefields in late 1943, Japanese intelligence made a catastrophic error. They classified it as a minor Wildcat upgrade. Nothing special, nothing threatening. Just another American fighter with a slightly bigger frame. This assumption would cost them thousands of pilots. Japanese analysts focused purely on specifications, wingspan, weight, visual profile. The Hellcat looked like the Wildcat's bulkier cousin, and since Zeros had been dominating Wildcats for years, there seemed little reason for concern. Early reconnaissance photos showed the familiar stubby fuselage and wide stance. Tokyo filed it away as heavier variant of existing model and moved on. But beneath that deceptively familiar exterior was a completely different beast. The Hellcat packed a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine delivering 2,000 horsepower, nearly double what the Zero could muster. It could hit 380 miles per hour, outpacing the Zero by over 50 miles per hour. 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns gave it overwhelming firepower, while reinforced armor and self-sealing fuel tanks kept pilots alive through damage that would obliterate lighter aircraft. What Japan's intelligence services completely missed was the philosophy shift. Grumman engineers had involved combat pilots directly in the design process. Every detail reflected real battlefield feedback. Better cockpit visibility, easier maintenance, superior stability. This wasn't theoretical engineering. This was survival technology built by men who'd faced death in Wildcats and refused to send another generation into the same trap. Japanese command remained fixated on their traditional metrics: maneuverability, climb rate, turn radius. They believed air combat was still about elegant dogfighting and pilot skill. The Hellcat's designers knew better. They'd built a flying tank that could absorb punishment, deliver devastating firepower, and return pilots home alive. By the time Japanese pilots encountered Hellcats in actual combat, the gap between perception and reality became brutally clear. These weren't upgraded Wildcats. They were apex predators specifically engineered to hunt Zeros. But Tokyo's dismissive analysis had already set a deadly precedent, underestimating an enemy that had learned from every previous mistake. The first combat reports trickling back to Japan described something disturbing. American fighters that refused to turn fight, that attacked with overwhelming aggression, then vanished before Zeros could respond. But High Command brushed these aside as pilot excuses for poor performance. What they didn't realize was that Japan's greatest advantage, Zero superiority, was already bleeding away, and the hemorrhage was about to become catastrophic. The Hellcat looked brutish compared to the Zero's elegant lines. Japanese pilots initially mocked its bulk, but that bulk was precisely what made it lethal. While the Zero sacrificed everything for maneuverability, stripping away armor, fuel tank protection, and structural reinforcement, the Hellcat embraced opposite principles. Its reinforced airframe could withstand battle damage that would snap lighter fighters in half. Pilots limped home with shredded wings, bullet-riddled cockpits, and engine damage that should have been fatal. They called it a flying tank, and they meant it as the highest compliment. Japanese engineers had designed the Zero for the perfect duel. American engineers designed the Hellcat for the brutal reality of war. The massive engine gave it superior climbing ability and speed in dives, crucial for the hit-and-run tactics that would define Pacific air combat. Heavy armor around the cockpit drastically reduced pilot fatalities. Self-sealing fuel tanks meant Zero's favorite tactic, puncturing fuel lines to cause fires, no longer worked. The Hellcat's high wing loading provided exceptional stability in dives and aggressive maneuvers, allowing pilots to execute slashing attacks the Zero couldn't match. But the engineering brilliance went beyond raw performance. The Hellcat was designed for carrier operations in ways that multiplied American effectiveness. It required significantly less maintenance than previous fighters. Its hydraulic landing gear eliminated the Wildcat's nightmare of hand-cranking 29 turns mid-flight. It handled better on carrier decks and could take off with heavier payloads, meaning more fuel, more ammunition, more mission flexibility. These weren't just technical achievements. They were force multipliers that Japanese planners never accounted for. While Zero pilots needed perfect conditions and expert maintenance crews, Hellcat pilots operated in harsh environments with field repairs and still dominated. The psychological impact of this survivability cannot be overstated. American pilots knew their aircraft would protect them. They could be aggressive, take calculated risks, and trust their machines to bring them home. Japanese pilots flew knowing a single lucky shot could ignite their fuel tanks or cripple their unarmored aircraft. Fear makes pilots hesitant. Confidence makes them deadly. Japanese intelligence reports from 1943 and early 1944 completely missed this engineering philosophy. They counted guns and measured top speeds, but failed to understand that the Hellcat represented a fundamental reimagining of what a fighter should be. Not the fastest or most agile, but the most effective at keeping pilots alive while destroying the enemy. By the time Japanese commanders understood this distinction, thousands of their best aviators were already gone. And the worst was yet to come, a single battle that would shatter Japan's aerial confidence forever. June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japanese commanders launched over 400 aircraft in what was meant to be a decisive strike that would cripple American carrier forces and turn the tide of the Pacific War. More than 300 never returned. American pilots grimly dubbed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and the name stuck because it perfectly captured the one-sided massacre that unfolded. The majority of Japanese aircraft were destroyed by a single fighter type, the F6F Hellcat. Not in desperate, evenly matched dogfights, but in systematic, almost casual destruction. Japanese analysts scrambled to understand what had happened. Their elite aviators, trained for years in tactics that had dominated the early war, had been swept from the skies with terrifying ease. Post-battle analysis was brutal and unavoidable. The numbers told a story that Tokyo could no longer ignore or explain away as pilot error. What made the massacre particularly shocking was the coordination. Hellcats didn't operate as lone hunters. They flew in disciplined squadrons, executing choreographed attacks with mechanical precision. Thatch weaves, defensive scissors maneuvers that had been refined into offensive weapons. High-side diving slashes that gave Zeros no time to react. Team ambushes that shattered Japanese formations before they could even organize defensive tactics. Zeros, designed specifically for one-on-one aerial duels, found themselves hopelessly outmatched. The romantic notion of samurai-style dogfighting meant nothing against coordinated team attacks from aircraft that were faster, tougher, and better armed. Individual pilot skill couldn't overcome systematic tactical superiority. For the first time, captured Japanese pilots and decoded communications revealed a fundamental shift in perception. Officers no longer discussed the Hellcat as a technical curiosity or minor threat. They now considered it a strategic problem with no clear solution. Memoirs from Japanese survivors speak of a growing dread that went beyond mere respect for enemy capabilities. They feared the method behind the attacks. The psychological impact rippled through Japanese naval aviation. Confidence evaporated. Even veteran pilots who'd survived since Pearl Harbor began second-guessing their training and tactics. Squadron leaders started altering flight paths specifically to avoid Hellcat heavy patrol zones. Entire missions were scrubbed if F6F formations were spotted in significant numbers. This wasn't cowardice. This was rational calculation overtaking propaganda and wishful thinking. The myth of zero invincibility had been shattered, and every Japanese pilot knew it. But understanding they were outmatched was only the beginning. What came next would prove even more demoralizing. The realization that American tactics made victory nearly impossible. Subscribe now for the untold stories that changed the course of aerial warfare. The Hellcat didn't win through elegance or superior maneuverability. It won because American pilots stopped trying to fight like their enemies and started exploiting weaknesses with cold, calculated precision. By mid-1944, US Navy and Marine pilots had abandoned romantic notions of dogfighting. They didn't care about one-on-one duels or who could execute the tightest turn. They'd perfected something far deadlier: systematic destruction through teamwork and altitude advantage. The boom and zoom tactic became the Hellcat's signature killing method: dive from superior altitude, unleash devastating firepower, then climb back out before the Zero could react. No extended dogfight. No giving the enemy a chance to use its maneuverability advantage. Just brutal, efficient violence followed by immediate disengagement. Japanese commanders initially misread this as cowardice. Their doctrine emphasized honor, direct engagement, and proving superiority through prolonged combat. When Hellcat pilots refused to turn fight and instead attacked from above repeatedly, Japanese leaders viewed it as dishonorable American tactics, running away instead of fighting properly. They were catastrophically wrong. It wasn't cowardice, it was control. Hellcat squadrons trained relentlessly on coordinated attacks. They practiced disengagement tactics as intensely as engagement. Every pilot entered battle with a playbook refined through painful early war lessons and executed with lethal precision. While Japanese pilots still relied heavily on individual skill and improvisation, Americans operated as synchronized killing machines. The psychological warfare aspect was equally devastating. Veteran Zero pilots began reporting encounters with American fighters that refused to play fair, yet kept winning. The frustration was palpable in their debriefs. They'd trained their entire careers for elegant aerial duels, and the Americans simply wouldn't participate in that kind of fight. Japanese training doctrine had prepared pilots for fluid, dynamic dogfights where superior maneuverability meant victory. But the Hellcat never let those fights develop. American pilots controlled altitude, controlled engagement timing, and controlled whether combat even happened. This complete tactical domination eroded Japanese morale faster than bullets could. Even more damaging was Japan's institutional resistance to adaptation. Their command structure viewed tactical evolution as deviation from honor-based warfare. While American doctrine constantly incorporated lessons from every engagement, Japanese leadership clung to principles forged in earlier victories against less capable opponents. The Hellcat hadn't just introduced a new aircraft, it had introduced a new philosophy of air combat, one that prioritized results over tradition, survival over glory, and systematic victory over individual heroics. Japan's failure to recognize this shift until it was far too late would prove strategically fatal. But the darkest truths were still hidden in documents Americans would soon capture. By early 1945, US intelligence had begun recovering something more valuable than destroyed aircraft or captured bases: Japanese communications that revealed the truth about how the Hellcat was perceived inside Imperial Command. The documents painted a picture far more desperate than public Japanese propaganda suggested. One decrypted report from Japan's elite 343rd Naval Air Group described the Hellcat not just as superior in performance, but as unrelenting in attack coordination. The analysis noted a deeply troubling pattern. Japanese formations were breaking apart under pressure before combat even began. Pilots were scattering preemptively when Hellcats appeared, abandoning tactical discipline out of pure survival instinct. This was a military catastrophe. Discipline and formation integrity were cornerstones of Japanese doctrine. Watching those principles crumble revealed how thoroughly the Hellcat had broken Japanese aerial confidence. Captured documents confirmed what Allied pilots suspected. The psychological effect of the F6F extended far beyond its mechanical capabilities. One squadron leader confessed during interrogation that his pilots felt hunted by Hellcats. His description was chilling. They arrive in silence, strike like thunder, and vanish before we can recover formation. We are not fighting pilots. We are fighting ghosts. Perhaps most damning was a classified training bulletin from late 1944 that reached American intelligence. It explicitly warned Japanese aviators about the Hellcat's growing dominance and urged pilots to avoid engaging F6Fs alone. The bulletin recommended using decoy tactics and emphasized numerical superiority as the only reliable counter-strategy. This was an implicit admission of complete inferiority. Japan's leadership was instructing pilots that their aircraft and tactics couldn't compete on equal terms. The only hope was overwhelming numbers or lucky circumstances, neither of which Japan could consistently provide as American industrial superiority flooded the Pacific with Hellcats. Reports from the Japanese naval technical arsenal went further, labeling the Hellcat as tactically dominant and acknowledging it had neutralized the Zero's greatest advantage. The analysis admitted that American fighters didn't need to out-turn the Zero. They simply never gave it the chance to turn at all. The most sobering revelation came from multiple captured officers who independently reported the same conclusion. Once Hellcats appeared in significant numbers, Japan realized it had lost command of the air. Not temporarily, not in specific regions, completely. These documents revealed something darker than military defeat. They showed a military establishment watching its foundational assumptions disintegrate in real time, unable to adapt quickly enough to survive. But the captured papers only confirmed what Japanese pilots already knew in their hearts. They were facing something they couldn't beat. Fear doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It creeps in slowly, quietly, until it fundamentally alters how warriors fight, think, and survive. By mid-1944, veteran Japanese pilots, men who'd once dominated Pacific skies with aggressive confidence, began showing unmistakable signs of psychological collapse. The Hellcat wasn't just defeating them mechanically, it was breaking them mentally. Reports from surviving Japanese aces revealed a profound shift in mentality. Where there had once been bravado and certainty, there was now caution bordering on paralysis. Squadron leaders actively altered flight paths to avoid Hellcat patrol zones. Entire engagements were aborted if F6Fs were spotted in substantial numbers. Missions were scrubbed not due to mechanical issues or weather, but because pilots refused to face overwhelming odds. This wasn't cowardice in the traditional sense, it was survival instinct clashing violently with propaganda-driven morale. Pilots complained about mechanical inferiority, certainly, but their debriefs were dominated by descriptions of Hellcat pilot behavior, cold, calculated, mechanical in execution. The term mechanical appeared repeatedly in Japanese assessments, and it wasn't a compliment. One veteran's testimony captured the psychological shift perfectly. We could no longer predict the Americans' next move. We feared even the approach. This represented a stunning reversal. The same Zero pilots who'd viewed Wildcats as target practice now second-guessed every decision when facing Hellcats. Hesitation in aerial combat is fatal, and American pilots exploited that hesitation ruthlessly. The thatch weave and boom and zoom tactics had accomplished something beyond preserving American lives. They'd shattered the samurai-style mentality that defined Japan's elite aviators. Japanese training emphasized personal honor, direct engagement, and proving superiority through skill. The Hellcats' coordinated team tactics made all of that irrelevant. Japan's military doctrine couldn't adapt because adaptation required abandoning core cultural principles about warfare and honor. American doctrine had no such constraints. Results mattered. Survival mattered. Victory mattered. Everything else was negotiable. By 1945, the psychological damage was complete. Japanese pilots entered combat knowing they were outmatched in aircraft, tactics, training, and industrial support. That knowledge created a self-fulfilling prophecy. Fear led to mistakes. Mistakes led to losses. Losses reinforced fear. The Hellcat ultimately won not just through superior engineering or tactical innovation, but through systematic psychological warfare that destroyed enemy confidence as effectively as its guns destroyed enemy aircraft. Japan hadn't lost to a better airplane. They'd lost to a better way of thinking about warfare itself, one that valued pragmatic victory over honorable defeat and cold efficiency over romantic ideals of aerial combat. The F6F Hellcat claimed over 5,000 aerial victories with the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any U.S. Navy fighter in World War II. But its greatest victory wasn't measured in numbers. It was the complete psychological dominance that broke Japan's aerial confidence forever. From dismissal to terror, Japan's perception shift revealed a darker truth. They weren't just fighting a better plane. They were facing an entirely new philosophy of warfare they couldn't counter. Keep watching for more forgotten stories of vintage planes that changed everything.